record that.
Perfect.
We're
Welcome,
on.
everyone. Yes, welcome to our UX Design Office Hours. I'm really excited. Today we have a career-oriented session with a special guest, Sandra Vickery, who is up late in London. And Fabio and Emily will be asking her questions about her career, how she got into UX design, and anyone is welcome to chime in with questions of their own. You can use the chat on the side of the screen, or you can unmute your microphone and ask out loud. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Fabio and Emily.
Emily, do you want to kick off?
Awesome. Yeah.
Awesome.
So thank you so much, Sandra, for joining us. Why don't we get started by having you tell us a little bit about your background, what you do in the UX field, what your current job is, what your responsibilities are, and just tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk. So I'm currently working as a contractor. I work in fintech, and I also help startups. Pretty broad range of kind of skills involved in that. So maybe I'll leave that to kind of delve in a little bit deeper. But generally I'm contracting through agencies, or I'm going straight to client side. And that can be anything from kind of 1 month up to 6 months on a project. It just depends how complex it is.
Awesome. We've had some students ask some questions about freelancing and contracting lately, so I'd love to hear more about, and Fabio, you too, like more about your experience being a contractor and what that was like establishing your client list, and how do you find clients, and how do you manage your time as a contractor?
Yeah, I have to say, initially when I got into it, I think it was quite a challenge. It was quite a while ago, so the landscape did look a bit different. And for me, I came to a new city, so there was those challenges. I would say there was this kind of weird thing about having London experience, even though it didn't actually mean anything in terms of skill sets. Clients and particularly recruitment agencies did see that had some importance, and I think it was to do with the communication and understanding the brands, understanding the clients that you had been working for. Now I tend to go through either recruitment agencies or direct, and when it's direct, it's because I either have worked there previously, like maybe a year before, or I know the contractors that are already in the agency. So they say, hey, I know someone who's really great, and there's a role opening, and they kind of connect the two. So when you initially start, it can be quite challenging because you have to reestablish yourself. But once you start building up a network of connections as people, or maybe product owners or business analysts, and you stay in touch with them, you see them in different places. It's amazing you can cross paths. Even today, I was talking to 2 different people who I'd worked with previously. One I actually bumped into, and the other one I just was reconnecting on WhatsApp. So that's really important, to network and stay in touch. And if you know good people, you help them out, they'll help you out.
Absolutely. The initial steps when you start doing freelancing, that's surely the hardest bit. And Sandra, you were in London, so it was a new city, a challenge, but still the UX scene and just the digital design scene is relatively strong and solid, and it was solid a few years ago. If you're starting out as a freelancer, you want to work remotely, and you can't just go to networking events in your own city. You got to do the online networking. It can be really, really challenging. Like really, really challenging. And the way to manage that is, again, always do the best work you can. Make sure that you're building up a solid portfolio of work, and even remotely, or not on site, not in the same city, make sure to create strong relationships, make sure to create and develop a strong network where you're providing value for whoever you're relating with. and make sure to do the proper networking. But we can talk about that contracting and how to get started later on. Kind of to continue on this, Sandra, it would be awesome to hear a little about how you got started in UX. So why did you choose, first things first, career in UX, and then how did you get started? I know the answer, but
Yeah, you do. We talked a lot about this, and it is actually an interesting question, because I read back and I realized that I didn't choose it. It actually chose me. And initially I was looking at developing my skill set in the digital environment, because I could see that there was a growing market for it. There was also a lack of skills in a lot of the places I was working, especially agencies. So I'm talking advertising agencies. So I was heading from a creative designer towards being a digital designer. And then naturally, because there wasn't so many user experience designers around at that time, I started to be doing a lot more kind of strategical and more of a crossover between the UI and the UX side. So what happened was I went into a recruitment agency one day, and she was looking at my portfolio, and she said to me, "Oh, you're actually a user experience designer." And I said to her, "What is that exactly?" This was quite a few years ago now. And she said, "Well, it's really good if you get into it, because there's definitely a growing market, and you can tell that your work is more strategical from a design point of view, and it's lending itself more to the user experience side of things." So that's how I got into it. And it just made sense, because at one point I needed to decide in my career path whether I was going to go down the technical route. I was learning ActionScript and a lot of digital design technologies, or do I go down the more strategical route, more on the marketing or the content strategy or user experience side? So for me personally, I preferred the strategical aspect, and that's where it's kind of started to shape itself towards the UX side.
That's awesome. I feel like a lot of people find that UX chooses them.
Yeah, fall into it.
Yeah. Are there any recent projects that you're excited about or proud of that you could share with everybody?
That's a good question. From the UX point of view, I'm constantly working on some. I don't know how much I can share on it. I think the one I would say I'm proud of is probably the one that's been the most challenging, and it's still in flow, and that's more of on the startup side. And the reason I think I'd say I'm proud of it is because I have to do a lot more. So it's not just about the UX, it's about understanding the marketing aspect and how that ties in, understanding the UI, understanding the product development. So the challenges make it, for me, kind of more of an interesting project, and therefore something I'm more proud of. But it means I need to encompass things like onboarding, which does cross over into the marketing side, and also understanding retention, because you're kind of following a customer through that entire process. So yeah, not being too specific on the details, but what it encompasses is all of those things.
Are you creating deliverables like wireframes, user flows? Like, what kinds of things are you making as part of all of that?
Yeah, it's interesting, because I bounced from a startup environment to a very corporate environment, like maybe working for a bank. The deliverables are really, really different, and the detail that's involved in those is different. So I try to bring a lot of the kind of methodologies into the startup world, but sometimes that's difficult because you're trying to do things in a very agile methodology, and you don't always need such high level deliverables. So it's kind of knowing what's going to be useful and not getting bogged down and doing too many things. So I will do things like sitemaps and user flows, and normally that's to communicate to another person in the team. If I'm working in something like fintech, the deliverables are obviously a lot more detailed for sure, and they're really important for stakeholder kind of meetings and communicating across different departments. So there's definitely a difference in what I'm creating. There's always something being created, so it's just the detail of it will change.
Interesting. That's awesome. It's I'll actually use this to make a bridge to a student question, which is really, really interesting. So Faraz asked, would you prefer freelancing or working for a company? So I want to hear your thoughts, Sandra, then I have a lot of personal thoughts on that as well.
Okay,
so,
great.
Yeah, would you prefer freelancing or working for a company? Pros and cons, what do you like?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's a good question because it isn't a very black and white way of answering. From my perspective, I've dipped in and out of both freelancing as well as full-time roles, and I think it's important to do that because the experience you get from one is very different. So, for instance, when you're in a full-time role, you can really embed yourself in a team and you can shape the organization and the project deliverables a lot more. I think you have a different kind of impact, but you also learn a different, you learn different things. When you're contracting, you are literally coming in, you're jumping into a project and then you're leaving. Normally, unless it's a very, very complex piece of work. I just don't think you can get the same experience from both. And I think my best way of approaching it is that I tend to go into one thing and then I kind of, maybe for a couple of years, I do a full-time role and then I come back and I contract until I've kind of got the experience I want. Sometimes within a full-time role, there's a glass ceiling, so you can't move around the department, and therefore you exhaust the skills that you can, learn from. And contracting, you do learn a lot. Well, that's my opinion.
Cool. On my end, I agree 100% with what you said, and I would go as far as adding that the answer varies more on your personal situation than it does on just one universal truth of whether it's better to work in a company or freelance. If you are working for a company and you've been doing that for quite a while and you don't feel as connected to the mission, then you'll probably have the yearning, you'll probably have that impulse to want to go freelance, have that flexibility, maybe become a remote worker, work from a beach anywhere in the world. You might want to do that. On the other hand, if you've been freelancing for so long, I've been freelancing for quite a bit now, might be the case with Sandra as well. I think it is, right? Then you might want to build your own thing maybe. You might want not work for another company, but build yours, work on your own startup, build your own project, have your own impact. And so the answer it depends on you, what you want to accomplish and where you want to be. Like in general, my preference, it depends. Again, I like freelancing, but yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I definitely prefer, for me personally, I prefer the contracting because it's good pay. You learn a lot. It's a very intense way of working. And I like the intensity that you're throwing in there. You really have to use your skills. So you do, I think from the UX perspective, you do tend to get more senior people required in roles. There aren't so many junior roles floating around at the moment. But you're right, like there is something nice about being embedded in a team, and sometimes the security is obviously necessary if you're in a certain position in your life. So if you can kind of contract, that's not everybody's cup of tea because it does have risks involved to it, not always having work.
Right. I'll also use this to answer one question just popped up from AK. What's the hourly high-end pay for freelance UXers? This also depends. Like, depends is going to be answer for most questions. But if you find yourself in San Francisco, the Bay Area, you can easily make, as a contractor, 150 if you're really, really good and you have the experience, even above 150. If you're in other metro areas, then it's probably going to hover around 100, 120-ish. And if you're not located in the US, you're located in some parts of Europe, then it changes just so much. Like, you're in Berlin, could be a rate, you're in London, could be another one. I'm not sure about Europe. Sandra, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I think for the UK, I'm not so sure about Europe. I'd say most day rates for kind of maybe mid UX skill set would be over 250. Normally higher. It really depends on your seniority. There's not, as I mentioned before, don't seem to be so many job roles for juniors, and I think that's because as a contractor you have to have a lot of experience. But that's not to say that there's not going to be more of those available. I do think the market will shift that way. As a senior, yeah, you can earn, probably 350 above. That's in pounds.
Just FYI, like for context, we're considering, again, mid to senior level experience. You have connections, you have a good portfolio when you know what you're doing. If you're just getting started, hello.
Sorry, this is Faraz. I asked a question.
Cool.
There's one of the comments that I think is also important with is that with contracting and due to the fact you're on a very short-term engagement, you do have the ability to charge a premium for your services as well.
That's something that was like the second thing I was going to bring up. It's not as if you're working 150 hours every month, total of 2,000 hours a year. Yeah, that's not a life. Like, no. I can see people listening to this like, that these guys are making 150. No, it's not like that. It's, you have shorter
yeah,
you have shorter amounts of hours per month, so it kind of evens out, balances out. So that's
also it depends if you're going direct or through a recruiter, because there'll be, there might be fees taken off on your day rate. Sometimes it's negotiable, and I mean it's always negotiable. And as you mentioned, the time duration. So there are lots of different factors.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. To kind of continue on the like, this could become a really good discussion of freelancing, by the way, if you go an office hours, just focus on that, invite a bunch of mentors. But to kind of continue in your background, Sana, because I think that's really interesting. We've spent hours talking about that, and I definitely want to continue on it. You've been doing UX now for quite a while, so you have experience in the field, you know what's out there. If you could give one tip to people who are just starting out, like people who are just starting off, right? What would that tip be? What do you think is one of the most important things that junior designers need to know, students?
I think, and I kind of wish I had a bit of a clearer understanding of this. I'll say two things. One is, you're in a luxury position now because there's lots of methodologies. So understanding, kind of having a clear understanding of all of those is always useful, because you need to communicate that understanding to other people. So communication is really important. The other thing is the importance of breaking down a problem. So I read something really interesting once, and I've always remembered this. Somebody online had written some comment about it in a UX forum and said, if they look at a portfolio and it looks too complicated, or the solution looks too complex, it's because the problem hasn't been broken down enough. And I think I was still at that stage where I was, always reshifting my portfolio and improving it. And I just thought, wow, that's such a great piece of advice, because if it hasn't been executed well, it's not finished, and it means that the problem isn't broken down. And so I often think about that when I'm working through something. And again, I think it's very good for communicating if you're in an interview, because the things that you should be clear about in your portfolio are things like what the problem was, what the solution was, and obviously talking about the deliverables, but also mentioning what the problems were that you had, because there always will be problems. And I think understanding and communicating those areas are really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would add one tip on top of that. I agree 100%. The tip is always ask why. Like always. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If it's part of the project, if it's before the project, if you're taking the course, like why are you taking the course? Why do you want to learn UX? And then when you're actually working on a problem or when you're working on a solution, always ask why. Why are you conducting this bit of research? Why are you using this tool? What do you want to accomplish with this survey question? What do you want to accomplish with this specific button in the wireframe? If you understand the reasoning behind things that you're doing, it's going to help you focus a lot more and just do great things.
It's good advice. And it's also going to help you communicate that to other stakeholders. So as a UX, you tend to be bouncing between different departments and teams. And one department will ask you why. And so you have to kind of like reiterate that a million times back to other people and explain it in their language. So yeah, that's a really good point. I agree.
Absolutely.
Related to that, do you ever get the chance to evaluate other designers to work with as a contractor, or do you ever have the opportunity to review resumes or interview designers?
Sometimes I'm working in a team where we require extra or additional resource. So, you know, yeah, if they're going to be working with me, then I tend to be asked to look at the work. I did actually do a contract once where I was more on the design side, but I was working in a design and a recruitment agency. So I saw a lot of CVs and portfolios come through. And it was really interesting because I learned quite a lot from that. Good and bad things, but definitely to do with layout. And personally, I'm always up for, you know, showing other people my portfolio to get their feedback, because I think it's just like anything. You can get too close to your own work and you just can't see the you know, the communication gets a little bit blurred. You know something so well, and when you kind of expect it to be obvious. So you need to step back, and sometimes stepping back means getting other people to critique your work.
Awesome. That's awesome. That's a again, agree 100%. I'm not gonna even add anything because I agree with that. That's cool. So you got some really good questions here from students. I want to start with the first one from Ellie. That's a cool question. Like, I'm gonna add that to my repertoire of questions. Sandra, what's the worst mistake you ever made as a designer?
Oh wow! I'm sure there's more than one.
Like the one worst $1 billion loss mistake. Emily, if you want to think of one in the meantime, by the way, I'm going to ask that question later.
It's pretty tricky, that one. I think a lot of the mistakes will come from communication. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, so I might need to mull on that for a little bit. But I think, you know, like maybe misunderstanding a brief and then going off into the wrong direction. I would have made these mistakes earlier on in my career, because now when it comes to getting a brief, like you said, you asked that question, why? You need to really pull it apart, because sometimes the brief that you get will come from a completely different part of the business, such as marketing. And they don't necessarily understand all the details that are required in order for the job to be executed in the right way. So I suspect that early on I was just very excited about getting a work brief in, and I probably just went off on a tangent and started producing things. And of course you're really proud of your materials, and then you bring it to them and you can't see any flaws. represent it back to the stakeholders, and they're like, this isn't what we asked for, which is kind of that moment when your kind of heart drops and you're like, oh, but it was so beautiful. So I would say, yeah, I tend now, if I get a brief and I really kind of go, okay, so what are they trying to achieve? What's the business case? Just your thing, like why? In order to get as much information as possible before I do anything else. So I'm sure there's been plenty of mistakes. I probably just psychologically suppress them.
I've been there and done that.
What's yours, Emily? What's yours?
Mine is really similar. I would say it has to do with communication as well. And I'm trying to think of a specific example, but I feel like it's happened probably multiple times. Happens often enough that I don't need a specific example. But yeah, it has to do with designing in a silo or in a vacuum, and spending too much time trying to work towards a solution without getting other people's eyes on it, whether that's fellow designers or stakeholders or anyone else. So thinking, I've learned that the earlier that I can get input and feedback and critique on my work, the better it will turn out. Because as Sandra said, without that, the further I get down a road that might not be the right one. And then it turns into a much bigger issue when the actual design presentation comes and everyone's expectations are off. So that can be tough, especially if I feel like that happens more often in my current job than I would like for it to. And I think that it has less to do with, or it probably has more to do with a moving target. And so sometimes it can be hard to pin down some of the stakeholders that I work with, and expectations change after a brief is given and after we do some discovery. So I think I am currently struggling to figure out the best way to communicate with my particular set of stakeholders and coworkers. Excuse me. Because it seems like everyone's communication requirements are different. And figuring out the best way to just maintain an open dialogue and get to a point of rapport where you can get naturally and organically get the most accurate information out of people is what I'm working on. And that's hard.
Yeah, I can actually add some more to that. I completely agree with the silo bit. It's something that I think is kind of difficult when you're just starting out is you feel really nervous about asking questions. You feel that sometimes asking questions is a weakness, and it means that you don't know what you're doing, or you maybe haven't grasped what's going on. But it's really, really important. And even if you have to apologize for asking questions, if you don't ask them, then the risks of kind of not getting it or going off track it just becomes bigger and bigger. So even though it might feel awkward, I think biting the bullet and just going, look, I don't really get I'm not really sure what the problem is that we're solving, and just being honest about it will make you feel a lot better in the long run.
Awesome.
Actually, the one other thing to add to that is that it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole of research, which could be another topic itself, but not kind of putting a fence around how much research you do around a topic, because that could be never ending. So I've definitely made that mistake before.
Always ask why before you begin the meeting. No, and that ties up to that tip. Know why you're doing the research. This is a general tip.
Yeah, you do. And you have to remind yourself, right? You have to remind yourself. So even if it's just for you to say, okay, what are we trying to achieve in this? Having it on a post-it note saying, this is our kind of goal.
Absolutely. On a quick note, my it's probably my worst mistake, was not even specifically in design, but managing clients. So I did a really bad job managing contracts, and I ended up with a crazy client who to this day owns me like $6,000. And the guy's just crazy. He didn't want to pay the bill because he claimed I didn't made expectations clear in the beginning, and I didn't because I didn't manage the contracts properly. That was a while ago. So quick tip, like when you're working as a designer, sometimes your mistakes are not going to be just with the actual design, but with how you manage people and contracts and expectations. So always use contracts as a freelancer. That sucks.
But you'll never do that again.
I'm never doing that again. And if I see that guy, I'm punching him. But anyway. Cool. We have another great question here in the chat. So Shu asked, whiteboarding exercises. Sandra, Emily, did you guys ever got caught off guard in an interview, and how did you manage that?
Emily, do you want to go first? Sure. So have I ever been caught off guard in an interview?
Yeah.
Every single interview.
No, but like having to conduct an exercise or do something on paper, whiteboard, something like that.
I don't tend to have to do that in interviews, if I'm honest. I don't think I've ever had an interview where I've had to get out my whiteboard marker and start drawing things. Mostly the interviews are either going through the portfolio. Is that what you mean? That kind of interview, or interview for a job, or interview like you're interviewing stakeholders for something? Just want to make sure I'm not going off track. But I've never used a whiteboard in an actual job interview before to show something. Normally I'm just talking through my portfolio, or we're talking about the intricacies of experience. They just want to know about your communication, I think. Once someone's seen your portfolio, then it's more about how you communicate.
Adding on to that, you've asked as well, how do junior, I can't even pronounce the word newbies. That's such a hard word to pronounce if you don't speak English natively. How do you prepare for interviews where you have to be creative on demand? Know the product. Like that's a tip. Know the product. If it's an e-commerce, mobile app, whatever is it that the company builds, even if it's something like Samsung, you're interviewing for Samsung or Apple, or they have multiple products, try to know as many of them as possible, especially the digital products. Like if you're interviewing, you need to know the product inside out, because then if you've got a creative challenge to fix something, fix part of the flow, maybe create a new feature, you're going to be really comfortable working with it. So yeah, that's probably the best tip on this scenario. Know the product, know what the company does, and be prepared to do that. Like, don't get caught off guard. Like, don't, like, whatever they propose, just take that as something awesome that you're going to work on. Like, hey, redesign checkout flow. Great. New sign up. Great. You know the product so well. It's awesome. You're gonna nail it. So know the product. It's a tip.
That's a good tip. I would say always ask them questions as well. Like, always have a question to ask the interviewer, because it shows that you've got an interest in the company, and also shows that you are kind of, I suppose, bold enough to want to know some kind of intricate details in the business, but kind of around the development side of it, or how the products are linked. So Samsung, for instance, or Apple, Apple's got a very complex business model. They've got a lot of products and they've got services. And so as a UX designer, even though you're not necessarily going to be solving those issues, you do need to understand the landscape of the products and the services and how they might work together, because a user sometimes will go through multiple aspects of the business. So iTunes to the iPod is an example of that.
Yeah, I would echo the ask lots of questions tip. If you're presented a design challenge or a whiteboarding exercise in an interview, I've been through that, and I have had a really good experience. It's been really fun, and I think it's an opportunity to take advantage of the scenario where you get to ask tons of questions. And the scenarios that I've been presented with have been not related to the product that the company I was interviewing for was making. They've been like made up scenarios, or, not sort of fake design challenges. So they present me with a problem, and I know, I'm sort of a stranger in a strange land. So I ask tons and tons of questions and figure out where the boundaries are, and force them to give answers or to say, I don't know, and then get as much information as you can, and challenge them to give you that information with the questions that you ask, and have fun with it. I think that can be kind of a fun activity to do during an interview.
All right, awesome. And since we're a little bit over our time here, to kind of wrap up, Sandra, we have a lot of people in this career office hours. One of the crowd, like, really cool room, great questions, great people, new faces. If you could give them one or two pieces of advice that they're gonna take throughout their lives, it's an important thing. Well, that no pressure, but this could change people's lives, right? Could change some lives here. Well, that advice be, Sandra? No pressure.
Okay, I think read a lot. There's so many great books out at the moment. And in fact, there's a few that have been released by Google recently, which I can tell you what they are. They've been recommended to me. One was recommended to me today, and it's called Sprint. And apparently it's amazing. And I also then went into one of my forums that I'm a member of, and they're also talking about it. So that's a good sign. And I think you've got to keep reading, because we're in the industry of technology, and it's constantly changing. Things are not static. Strategies are not static. And they're great conversations to have when you go into an interview. If you know more about what's happening in the kind of outside world than the interviewer, then it's impressive. That's my tip. Read.
Read. Awesome. Phenomenal, then. Katarina?
Yeah, thank you so much for joining, Sandra. Awesome insight,
thank you.
great questions from everyone. And yeah, really excited to see sort of our global Springboard community. It was sort of alluded to, but Fabio and Sandra actually met up in person, which is really exciting, and got to talk. And so if you're ever traveling, post in the community and let people know so you can meet up with other Springboarders around the world, whether they're students or mentors. We're building a really cool global network. So thanks everyone for joining, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you, Sandra.
One quick note before we go, just remind us this. She posted a phenomenal link, which is uxpin.com/studio/ebooks. There are lots of great ebooks there. So if you guys didn't see the link, it's here in the chat, or there, somewhere in the chat. Check out the link, it's really good, lots of amazing content. I have some books published there as well, so I'm going to do some promotion here. But it's really an amazing link. You guys should check that out. All right, then. See you guys next week.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.